So we're here today to talk about Crossrail, and I've been asked to talk about closeout strategy. I think there are many interesting aspects we could have reflected on for NEC from a Crossrail perspective, and we're going to try and narrow it down to closeout. I'm going to talk a bit about the project, the contracts we've got, how they're structured, and some of the issues and how we've dealt with those. Sean is going to go on to talk about more about the program controls around that and the systems and processes that we've used. So first of all, just to get this in perspective, I'm really here talking about the central section of Crossrail, which is the majority of the spend. The part from Paddington out to Reading, out to Shenfield, out to Abbey Wood, the on-network works is being delivered by Network Rail under a separate agreement with us. I'm talking here about the central section, the tunnel section, and this slide shows the progress of the tunnelling. The two red sections are tunnelling that's yet to be completed, and as the video showed, that we are about 50% or just over 50% complete. But how does that translate into contracts that we're interested in? We've got about 7 major design contracts, about £400 million of employers' design. Actually, our delivery partners, obviously we need to appoint those. We've got 2 major delivery partners, about £500 million worth of spend. We had a load of enabling works contracts quite early on. It's very important to get ahead of the game on a scheme like Crossrail, get your utilities out the way and demolition done. About 20 contracts, about £150 million worth. Stations advance works. This is really all about the piling and diaphragm walling at our major stations. About 5 contracts, about £300 million in total. Tunnels and portals. Everyone thinks of Crossrail, thinks of the tunnels and the major construction contracts. And there's 9 of those, about £2.5 billion. Stations, 8 station contracts. This is really the completion of the civils, the M&E and the fit-out. About £1.2 billion. And finally, not forgetting the systems, obviously this is a railway, it's not just a civils programme, and about 6 major systems contracts amounting to £500 million. The interesting thing is all these are NEC-based contracts. We've used just about every form of NEC, the professional services contract, the option C for the main works contracts that I'll talk about, option A, option B, measured term. We've not used F. But I think the reasons that Ian explained. So we are steeped in the use of NEC, and that's useful for us for a number of reasons, in that there's a common terminology and language across the programme that everyone understands, from the top of the organisation down to the bottom. Just delving into that in a little bit more depth, this is a typical station layout. And just really to explain that this will be made up of a number of different contract packages. This is Bond Street, a perspective you don't obviously normally see when you go down to see the site. And early on there would have been some enabling works, demolition contracts and moving some utilities around. Then we had the 2 station box contracts for either end. And at the moment, obviously, the SCL and the board tunnels have actually gone well through that section, and they're currently doing the SCL enlargements there. The station fit-out is a separate contract again, and then you've got the systems coming through. And I think the point really is that for us as a programme, it's not about one individual contract. It's about a puzzle of a number of contracts that have to interface and have to work together. And that very much affects the contracting and the commercials and the commercial behaviour and how we have to deal with those contracts. I think the video probably showed all this much better, but there's some nice, sexy photos of Crossrail. You've got the TBM being dropped in at Limo on the top left. You've got Paddington Station, as it will finally look, a section through Paddington Station. At the top right, which is slightly different because it's one of the only stations that's a big box construction. You've got Moorgate at the bottom left. That is a fantastic site when you go and visit it. It's will be an incredibly deep excavation there, about 45 metres plus deep. by the time we get down the bottom, and a picture that's often shown on the bottom right, which is the enormous spray concrete lining cavern at Stepney Green. So I'm told the biggest cavern in Europe, and that's where the two lines kind of meet and join together. And just another interesting picture on Crossrail. This just shows the complexity of work at Tottenham Court Road, and also really the point that it's not just us who are working in London on Crossrail. There are others, principally LU, Network Rail, all sorts of OSD developers that we have to interact with. The red is really the existing station at Tottenham Court Road. The pinky browny colour is LU's new station, and the blue is what we're building. And coming through that is the tunnel that was almost sort of directed very accurately, I think 900 millimetres or so below the piles, right through the middle of that work site. So that's all very interesting, but how does it all translate into NEC, the world of NEC and NEC contracting? When I was first asked about closeout, I kind of, like, my natural reaction was, well, it's easy because you just get to the end and you've done everything, haven't you, of course, under NEC by the time you get to the end. And of course, that isn't quite right. And it's very important that you consider at the beginning how you are going to finish off these contracts. We have consistent terms and conditions across all our Option C contracts. This is really what I'm talking about here. We have a 50-50 pain gain, a fairly simple, uncapped 50-50. And I know Ian spoke about some of the kind of decision making about that earlier. And we also have no fee over the target, so it's a bit harder than 50-50. The other key thing that we've done is we've progressively apply the pain share. So rather than get to the end and ask for some money back if it is in pain share, the PM progressively applies that. We also have substantial liquidated damages. I've explained kind of the complex interaction between our contracts. That means that one late contract is delaying another one, and we need that picture to work. So we have substantial LDs. Now, I think these two factors, what they do is they encourage ourselves and the contractors to sort issues out as we go along. It discourages leaving things until the end. It does make things perhaps slightly more painful as you go through, but it does make everyone hopefully pay attention and agree things as they go. I think it also therefore discourages us as a client from any sort of dysfunctional type of behaviour, i.e. looking towards disallowed costs to keep us going to a point where we can sort out the pain share, gain share, which I think potentially has been a problem on some contracts. So hopefully it kind of keeps everyone honest as they go through. We have very experienced project managers with very good teams, I believe. I mean, it is a big program. It attracts experienced, good people. We have also done a lot of NEC training to reinforce that. And we have, as Sean will show, some very good systems and processes that monitor our project managers and to make sure that they are performing. Maintaining the contract timescales, including doing project manager assessments where they have to. We are a proactive employer. We have to look at Crossrail as a programme of works. It's no use taking just looking at one contract as a microcosm. You have to look at the effect that is having across the programme of works. So we have had to engage in situations, and we've done X12 incentives or the like to encourage contractors to complete certain timescales. We have had to look at how we award scope through the programme and make adjustments there. On a programme like Crossrail, stuff does happen. Third parties change their minds. Things occur with oversight developers, with LU, with Network Rail, which means that you have to be, as an employer, fairly nimble on your feet with looking at the agreements, talking to contractors and getting arrangements in place to make sure that works. And also through to, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, through to dispute discussions and adjudications. We're not actually adverse to going to adjudication if we can't agree with the contractor a way of settling it. We actually would rather do that and get the issue dealt with and move on. Okay, so now thinking about specifically about contract closeout, what are the issues that we see or we have on Crossrail? Now, first I would say that Crossrail and contractors, maybe to a lesser extent, want finality. They want to know that by and large the commercial discussions are over with. Crossrail is a temporary organisation. We're not here forever. We want to pack up and go home at some point and hand over this asset to the operator. Now, actually, NEC doesn't really do that. It's very vague when it comes to this area. There's no final account as such. In fact, there doesn't seem to be anything that encourages people to kind of put their final position on paper. The project manager just seems to keep assessing until the defects date. So it doesn't really focus people's minds. Obviously, all compensation events may not be agreed. Now, I've spoken about, yes, we expect our project managers to do PMAs. Where they cannot agree by quotation or acceptance, do the PMAs, and that certainly happens. But I think what you get is this no man's land potentially where contractors maybe disagree, but they won't do anything about it. They just continue to grumble. So you're left with this kind of, they won't go off to adjudication, and they won't do anything about it. They just continue to grumble. So you get this kind of just CEs that are unagreed, but nothing's being done about it at the end of a contract. Define cost. I find this very curious because NEC makes you do everything as you go. Tight timescales on issuing communications, agreeing things. Define cost has no timescales around it at all. In fact, the contract says that you can adjust an assessment at any time. And I think I kind of understand why, because it's quite hard to pin down defined cost until you get to the end, and it's just one big bucket of defined cost. But again, it really doesn't help in terms of trying to close things down. Other amounts, clearly there are a number of other things that may happen where one party or the other party owes the other one money, often outside of any pay and gain share mechanism, a kind of below the line adjustment. And certainly where we've got those sorts of issues, they can linger on further than you would ideally like to do close out the contract commercially. And defects, either not corrected or defects realised after completion, is obviously another area where you can get lingering issues that take a lot of time to sort out, especially where you've got one contractor handed over to the other, not in charge of the site. So what are some of the kind of solutions? How have we dealt with some of these things? First of all, I would say we do look at doing a full and final settlement at some point, sometimes well before the defects date, if we feel that's possible, but very much on a value for money basis. Obviously, we have to be accountable for every penny we spend. We only do a settlement if it is at the right value, at the right price. But that just does give us some certainty, and it's something obviously the contract doesn't allow for, and that we do on top of the contract a settlement agreement. We do ensure complete C assessment on time. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the tools around that. We're also looking at interim agreement of defined costs. So to try and force the pace, and some of our contracts are long, they're 4 or 5 years long. So to actually enter into a formal agreement with a contractor, kind of a mini settlement agreement, if you like, as we go to close off big chunks of defined cost. Now, I would say contractors are very keen on this. Obviously, the big thing they're worried about is someone's going to come along at the end and say, actually, oh boy, you know, I'm going to start taking big chunks of money off your account because I've had a look at your accounts and I don't quite like what I see. Now, we have no intention of doing that. And as you can see, my next point is about contemporaneous deduction of disallowed cost, which is obviously the other side of the coin to define cost. We very much encourage our project managers to disallow costs at the time, to put it to the contractor why the cost is being disallowed, to force the issue. Do not leave it until the end and come back and then have a look and say, well, I'm going to start disallowing costs. You're just asking for a problem to develop there, really. And lastly, proactive dispute discussions if required. We are a proactive employer. We are obviously we don't interfere with the project manager. We let him get on with his job. But if at the end of the day, after PMAs are done, we are happy to talk to contractors about disputes, and we will try and settle. And as I say, if we can't, we are quite happy to go off to adjudication. And I would say, actually, just from experience, that we're probably more comfortable with that than contractors, than the majority of contractors. And I'm not sure quite why that is. I think it could be because, maybe they have in the past had some strange results, and certainly where it's tricky issues, and that they don't necessarily feel comfortable sort of rolling the dice in those situations on what is, as you can imagine, on Crossrail, some fairly chunky outcomes. So I think that's the end of my piece. I think Sean is going to talk about some of the program controls issues.
Thanks, David. Just conscious of lunch, I'll try and be as quick as I can. We've heard a lot this morning around how to set up contracts effectively, use of various options and Z clauses. What I want to do really was trying to... wrong direction. I think we've got a bit of problem with the formatting on the slides, but not to worry. So it's not K&L Gates, but the words are there, they're my words. So what I want to do is give some demonstrations on how we actually monitor and measure and utilise the contract conditions to support effective closeout. So at Crossrail, we thought of closeout from the very beginning. It's enshrined within our contract admin policy, and it's always been a primary aspect of successful delivery of the programme. It's not something that we're thinking towards the end of the job. And the halfway video is quite important to us for lots of reasons, but I think you can see from some of the stats I'll show in a moment, how well we are controlling the programme. So policy for closing out contract was set very, very early on, and we've invested heavily in process and systems. I think we spent probably 2 million plus on EB, contract management and associated technology. I appreciate on a project the size of Crossrail that's quite easy, and it's not a significant sum of money, but in general context that's a big investment. But the policy and the tools and systems are focused around good practice to meet contractual obligations, as well as supporting closeout. So strict adherence to programmes, submission acceptance, we heard about that earlier this morning, and again David reiterated that. Compensation events are effectively managed, defined costs is progressively assessed, and all deliverables are received prior to or just at completion. The key thing really is making sure that at completion we have got everything we absolutely need. And the issue around settlement of the final account, if you want to use that terminology, is a little bit nebulous in the contract, but we're trying to promote good practice so that we can reach a project manager's final assessment at the completion date if we can, and then by way of possible supplemental agreements with the employer actually sign off as full and final settlement, or a point in time soon thereafter. And this is all supported with systems and tools. So we monitor programs very, very closely. You can see there lots of red, amber and green, and each of those lines represents one of our major contracts. value of anywhere between 100 and 600 million, depending on what it is. And the importance of the programme, can't be overstated. It's fundamental to assessing the impact of compensation events. It's fundamental to assessing entitlement around time and likelihood of LDs, meeting key dates, all that kind of good stuff. But also we use it to determine our progressive assessment closeout around payments and when key milestones will be reached in a contract and when we can possibly package up the costs, agree with the contractor and hopefully offer those up to the employer for full and final settlement with the contractor. So it deals with the no going back. So the contractor has surety that his costs have already been assessed and paid, and actually there'll be no attempt in the future to go back and claw any of that back through disallowed cost provisions. So it provides the data to drive the progressive assessment agenda, and completion and plan completion is effectively managed. Progress and delay is actually reviewed, so resolutions can be progressed way before completion. It touches again on David's point around being proactive around adjudications, disputes, project managers' assessments. We really want to try and deal with everything as they arise and not towards the end of the contract. So the points up in the top right corner, all contracts are individually tracked. Every 4 weeks we get an update. We mandate a programme is issued for acceptance and we track whether that programme was accepted. So you can see there by the reds that there are some contracts that fail to get an accepted programme in place. There'll be a number of reasons for that, but we have set a corporate KPI against which certain people are incentivised of 85% of all programmes to be no more than 3 months old in any given period. And you can probably see a trend towards the right-hand side now that there is improvement there. So management of programmes is very, very important. Compensation events, again, apologies for the formatting. I won't risk moving that out of the way. Or maybe. No, it's not going to work here. So the processing of compensation events is very closely monitored. We don't only track the volume and value, but we track the age of them also. So again, this maintains the sort of contemporaneous aspiration about dealing with change as and when it arises. It protects the efficacy of the contract in terms of incentivisation, the commercial model. It drives the right behaviour around programme submission and making sure the programmes are properly updated. And again, the use of project manager assessment is actively encouraged. We don't see project manager assessment as a sign of failure or weakness. It's actually driving the process. And if the contractor isn't able to perform or give a quotation in a timely manner or one that properly reflects the nature of the change, we will assess. The contractor has always got the remedy to take that to dispute if he so chooses, but that's again something we would actively encourage if it's the right thing to protect the efficacy of the contract. So in terms of volume, halfway through now, nearly 14,000 compensation events are raised on Crossrail with a value of approximately 1.2 billion. Now that's our assessment of the value, not the contractor's. The contractor's assessment can in some instances be quite a bit more. So of those 14,000, 13,173 have been processed. Now, I think that's pretty good, given the rate of change and the volume they're being raised, to have compensations processed to the value of about 1 billion, I think is a credit to the team. So, there's only 820 compensation events open as of 3 weeks ago, with a value of about 193 million. That's 193 million on £8 billion of capital delivery against our major projects. So, compensation event management is critical to us. I mentioned also about agedness rather than just value. So another key metric down there's a table in the bottom left corner. We track the compensation events that are open, and again we're very keen to make sure the compensation events are processed, implemented, withdrawn, rejected. You see there that 204 have been raised, open that are only 28 days old. So they're the ones that typically raised in the period. 194 have been open for about 29 to 56 days, 101, 57 days, 24, and only 88 are older than 196 days. And we're really focusing on those 196 day plus open compensation events. Typically they're the ones that are tricky, that there's issues around scope definition, Typically, there could be just small beer stuff that everyone isn't really prioritised at the moment. But the message we're trying to get across is get everything implemented. Maintain the target, maintain the incentive, maintain the efficacy of the contract and the programme. So the chart on the top left, as you see, there's a very fine green line at the bottom. It's just trundling around the bottom, around 900 open compensation events. Spend a lot of time making sure that doesn't go above 800 or 900 in any given period. So last period we had 820 open. So 5.9% of all open, so of all compensation events raised to date remain open. Again, the corporate KPI of no more than 10% raised would be open any period. And as I just said, of that 10%, we're actually down at 5.9, so we probably need to make that target a little bit harder next time. It's a challenging process, however. We have 300 compensation events raised every period, at least 300. The value can vary. There'll be some big negative values in there. There'll be some massive cost items as well. But over 300 to 400 NCs are raised each period. It takes a lot of time to process that. So that's compensation event management, and we'll talk about systems and tools, how we do that in a moment, very briefly. The other thing that David mentioned was about assessing defined costs. We progressively levy gain contractor share paying if it's applicable. We want to certify and get the project managers to agree with the contractors their cost on a progressive basis. We don't want to be having big discussions at the end of the contract around entitlement. So what this chart shows is the culmination of around about £3.5 billion worth of cost that we think we can package together on a contract-by-contract basis, so that by the end of the programme, so the far right of the chart is 2018, we will have assessed and ideally offered up to the employer to do a full and final settlement with the contractor. There are some big spikes in there, and there'll be challenging periods, but the key thing is we're going to close out defined costs as soon as we possibly can. So NEC isn't prescriptive in this area, so we're just looking at how we can encourage the contractors to perform and how we can support the contractors and the project manager and their team in delivering that requirement. We all recognise it's good practice. The contract isn't particularly helpful in how to do that, so we're just trying to be proactive and drive some best practice through policy. So employers keen to settle and support that process with the contractor, and that will be via a supplemental agreement, because as we know, the project manager makes his final assessment at defects date, and there is no final account as such. So we want to enter into supplemental agreements. It benefits the contractor because he's certain of his cost recovery, and typically each contract has 3 or 4 milestones where we will write those full and final settlements if it's appropriate. So 25%, 50%, 75%, and at completion. So when we hit completion, they've got ideally 75% of their cost agreed, settled in the bank. They can declare they're not at risk of us going back around disallowed costs. So financials are concluded soon after completion, which is great, and the contract in its entirety can be closed out soon after completion. So that's the plan, the aspiration. You know, it's early days yet, but we're getting there. So the next slide really just shows the little stars are where these, what we call milestones, where each contract will put forward a component of cost, a package of subcontract costs and schedule of cost component items. Project manager will assess that bundle, present it to the employer and the contractor for full and final settlement. You can see that probably about a third of the way, a quarter of the way along, there's quite a number of stars stacked on top of one another. We need to normalise that. We can't manage that level of cost and level of verification, but the intention is to progress all of those contracts over the next 4 years or so. And very simply, in terms of systems and tools, as I said, we've invested heavily in contract management processes. The way we manage our information management, BIM, and technical information design management is through an environment called EB. So Bentley product. They provide us with other software platforms as well, and we've specifically bespoked that workflow environment within EB to create a CA, a contract admin component. Bentley are now taking that forward to develop that as core product, and we're supporting them in that initiative. But basically that means all the PMCs, notified compensation events, early warnings, instructions, etc., all managed, all communications are through EB. I've tied it into contract quality, so it links in with technical, RFIs, NCRs, defects notices, and therefore any commercial impact or obligation upon the PM to respond to an RFI if it's a change in requirement that's come through technical. We pick it up in terms of commercial. We issue the appropriate PMI saying it's a change to works information. We issue or drive the supervisor to issue the defects notice, and we manage that commercially as well. So the technical, quality world and the commercial world interact very, very closely as a consequence of this system. And a lot of it is surfaced through dashboards which are accessible through the internet globally, and I think it's a pretty good system. Maybe I'll come back some other time and actually demo that, but in principle there's just some screenshots there of the ClickView dashboard on the top left, which is just contract admin stats, everything you'd want to know, compensation events values, outstanding information, value of change, and it's by work package, by contract, by area or program wide. There's a whole host of other screenshots there around EB contract admin in terms of the communications, the quick reference guides, and other dashboards we use for driving contractor and PM performance around implementing compensation. And so a lot of investment there, and I think it works very, very well.